Welcome back to Askewed Reviews. And this week we are doing a theme week, and it is 80s adventure kids teams. So today we are doing the 1987 film Adventures in Babysitting. Here is your trivia question for today. What celebrity does Chris keep getting confused for? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So our film starts off this time in Oak Park, Illinois, where we get to meet Chris Parker, who is getting ready for her date with her boyfriend Mike. Now, Mike, who is going to take Chris to a fancy French restaurant, shows up early to notify her with a very flimsy excuse that he can no longer go out with her tonight. So now that Chris no longer has plans for the evening, she accepts a babysitting gig watching a girl named Sarah Anderson who has an obsession with the Marvel Comics character Thor. Now, Sarah has a brother named Brad who also has an obsession of his own, and that happens to be Chris. So instead of going out and spending the night at his best friend's house, he instead is going to hang around with her. Now, while the three of them are hanging out, Chris gets a phone call from her best friend, Brenda, who has decided to run away and is now stuck at a bus station in downtown Chicago, and she needs Chris to come pick her up, as she's being harassed by some homeless people and a man with a gun. So Chris reluctantly agrees to pick up Brenda, and because Sarah and Brad overheard the conversation, they manage to weasel their way into a trip to the city. Brad's annoying best friend Daryl also manages to find out what's happening and manages to blackmail his way onto the trip as well. So all four of them begin traveling towards the city of Chicago. And if you've thought that you had a bad night of babysitting, have you ever had to deal with all of this? Have your car get a flat on the highway, run into a psychopathic truck driver, have a carjacker steal the car that you're currently in, run into mobsters that are willing to chase you down and try to kill you, and of course, run into the middle of a gang war? So will Chris be able to get all of the kids and Brenda back to the suburbs safely? And will they manage to do it before Brad and Sarah's parents get back home? This movie was directed by Chris Columbus. This was also his directorial debut. The movie primarily takes place in Chicago, Illinois, and some of it was actually filmed there. A lot of it was also filmed in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and a little bit in Los Angeles, California. The original movie concept was actually thought up in the 1960s. Jane Fonda was possibly going to play the lead for it as well. Early drafts of the script actually had a lot of differences. For instance, Sarah was not actually into Thor like she is in this movie, she was obsessed with She-Ra and He-Man. Thor being added in was actually an idea of Chris Columbus, who also was a fan of Marvel Comics. In fact, at one point, he wanted to become a comic book artist for Marvel. Also, in early drafts of the script was a scene that took place at Soldier Field, where some of the Chicago Bears players, including Jim McMahon, Walter Payton, William Perry, and Mike Singletary, would actually have shown up. There would have been a scene where Daryl actually smuggled some of the actual team members' jock straps out as souvenirs. The jock straps would later show up and be used to make up the shortage of cash needed at Dawson's garage to pay for the car. Also, when it comes to the character of Dawson that was played by Vincent D'Onofrio, that character was originally supposed to be an androgynous woman. I also can't help but wonder, at least a little bit, had they kept it in the script that Sarah was obsessed with She-Ra and He-Man, what D'Onofrio's outfit might have actually looked like, because they clearly did try to have it look just a little bit, at least color scheme, and with that hammer, like Thor. Elizabeth Shue does such a great job as Chris in this movie. It's hard for me to see anyone else as that character, but there were actually quite a few other actresses up for the role, including Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Jodie Foster, Michelle Pfeiffer, Valerie Bertinelli, Justine Bateman, Bridget Fonda, Sharon Stone, Kathleen Turner, Kelly McGillis, Brooke Shields, Melanie Griffith, Tatum O'Neal, Andy McDowell, Heather Langenkamp, and even Molly Ringwald. So, do you know what Adventures in Babysitting, Back to the Future Part 2, and Back to the Future Part 3 all have in common? Well, in all three movies, they have Elizabeth Shue playing a character with the last name Parker, whether it's Chris or Jennifer. Also, both in this film and Back to the Future Part 3, Elizabeth Shue faints and says the phrase, "I had the worst nightmare." Keith Coogan plays the character of Brad Anderson, but what's interesting is apparently Coogan actually did have a crush on Shue, which helped with the character. Unfortunately, at one point he did end up asking her out. Shue mistakenly laughed at that proposal. Only 4 years after this film, Coogan would appear in another babysitting movie that got pretty well known as well, called Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. Did you happen to know that Keith Coogan is actually the grandson of Jackie Coogan, the young actor who played the kid alongside Charlie Chaplin? Another thing that unfortunately Jackie Coogan is known for is all of the money that he made from acting his mother spent. So it's now because of him that they created the Coogan Law, where now children who do act have a percentage of what they're making set aside so that when they are of age, they have some money that they can actually use. This is actually Anthony Rapp's feature film debut. They also had him dye his natural blonde hair to red, as the producers didn't want people confusing him for Anthony Michael Hall. Now, if you're into musical theater, you probably know Anthony Rapp much more as the character of Mark from Rent. Not only was he part of the original Broadway cast, but he also played the character in the movie. Penelope Ann Miller, who plays Brenda in the film, also had her feature film debut in this movie. Bradley Whitford, who plays Mike in the film, was allowed to use his own Camaro. Now, what's funny is the license plate, So Cool, was actually his license plate. The blues musician in the film is actual blues musician Albert Collins. Elizabeth Shue's brother, Andrew Shue, actually plays an extra in the film. Anthony Rapp's older brother, Adam Rapp, actually plays one of the gang members. When the truck driver Pruitt goes on his rampage, he actually knocks over a lawn jockey. This is actually something that would become an ongoing joke for Chris Columbus, as he would have this occur in both Home Alone 1 and 2. Speaking of Chris Columbus, he actually wrote the script for Gremlins, and there's a little nod to that in the film, as on Sarah's backpack, you can see Gizmo. Deborah Hill was a producer on this film and the original Halloween. Now, there's a little nod to Halloween in this one, as when Sarah and Chris are both watching the TV, you can see the movie and hear the Halloween theme. This was put in since both films were about babysitting. There's an alley in this movie that actually gets used in quite a few other films as well, including The Fly, Police Academy, and My Pet Monster. Speaking of alleys, they actually had to add more garbage to most of the ones they used in the film, as Toronto's garbage collection was too efficient. The scene where Brad gets stabbed in the foot by the gang member was actually filmed in reverse. The high school from the film, named Hemingway High, was actually fictitious, but it was named for Ernest Hemingway. In 1989, there was an attempt to make an Adventures in Babysitting television series. They actually even made a pilot that was starring Jennifer Guthrie as Chris, Joey Lawrence as Brad, and Brian Austin Green as Daryl. In 2016, there was actually a Disney Channel original movie that was technically a reboot of the original film, but it had no connection to it, and it starred Sabrina Carpenter and Sophia Carson. So when it comes to the film Adventures in Babysitting, this is definitely an absolute classic from the 80s. I really enjoy this movie, but rewatching it, I will say there were some things that just absolutely did not make any sense, but it's still entertaining. So I think I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 5. And if you really enjoyed the movie, some other movies I would recommend checking out are Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, Uncle Buck, Risky Business, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what celebrity does Chris keep getting confused for? So apparently, no matter where she goes, everybody keeps thinking that Chris is Miss March from the most recent issue of Playboy. What's interesting is, those are actually pictures of Elizabeth Shue, and they were actually taken at the Playboy Mansion, but none of them were actually nude shots. In fact, Elizabeth Shue still keeps a copy of that fake Playboy to this day. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.